I'm 68 years old, and for 39 years I've carried the guilt of the most beautiful act of trust I ever witnessed, and how I repaid that trust with betrayal that still makes me wake up choking on my own shame. Before this emphysema takes what little breath I have left, I need someone to know about Gabriel, about the single shared meal that changed both our lives forever, and about what happened afterward that proved just how little humanity really exists in the hearts of people who call themselves civilized. My name is William Harper, and in October of 1984, I was a 29-year-old park ranger stationed at the Hoh Rainforest in Olympic National Forest, Washington. I'd taken the job because I believed in protecting wilderness and helping people understand their connection to the natural world. What I never expected was to become the caretaker for the most gentle soul I've ever encountered, or to learn that sometimes the greatest evil comes not from the wilderness, but from the people who claim to protect it. Gabriel. I named him that because he appeared like an answer to prayers I didn't know I was praying, was dying when I found him collapsed beside the Hoh River on a gray October morning that felt like the earth itself was grieving. He was massive, easily 8.5 feet tall, but so emaciated that his ribs showed through fur that had lost its natural luster. His breathing was shallow, labored, and he'd clearly been without adequate food for weeks, maybe months. I should have followed protocol. I should have reported the discovery, called for backup, treated him as a potentially dangerous wildlife encounter that required professional management. Instead, I looked into eyes that held intelligence, pain, and a resignation that reminded me too much of my own father during his final days of cancer, and I made a choice that would define the next 6 weeks of my life. I carried him. All 250 pounds of dying giant, I somehow managed to get him back to my remote ranger station, where I could provide care without the questions and procedures that would have meant his death or capture by people who would see him as a specimen, rather than a suffering soul who needed help. For 6 weeks, from October 15th until November 28th, 1984, Gabriel lived in the back room of my ranger station, slowly recovering his strength while we developed a friendship that transcended every boundary I thought existed between species. He was remarkably intelligent, learning English words with the speed of someone whose mind was naturally suited for communication. More than that, he demonstrated kindness, curiosity, and a capacity for gratitude that put most humans to shame. But it was our first shared meal together on October 18th, 3 days after I'd found him, that revealed the depth of his character and set in motion events that would destroy both our lives. What happened during that simple dinner of canned soup and day-old bread showed me that Gabriel possessed something I'd rarely encountered in my 29 years, a soul capable of perfect innocence and unconditional trust. He blessed the food. Before taking a single bite, Gabriel placed his massive hands over the meal I'd prepared, closed his eyes, and made soft sounds that could only be described as prayer. Not the formal recitations I'd learned in church, but something deeper. Gratitude expressed with an authenticity that made me understand I was witnessing something sacred. Then he did something that broke my heart and sealed his doom. Gabriel insisted that I eat first, gesturing with elaborate courtesy that I should take the initial bite of food that was meant for his recovery. When I tried to indicate that he needed nutrition more than I did, he became gently insistent, clearly communicating that proper manners required the host to eat before his guest. That simple act of grace, a dying creature insisting on etiquette while starving, revealed that Gabriel's people had sophisticated social customs, moral codes, and spiritual practices that human anthropology had never documented. He wasn't just intelligent, he was civilized in ways that put our own society to shame. The meal lasted 2 hours, not because there was much food, but because Gabriel turned eating into a ceremony of gratitude and fellowship. He asked questions through gestures about my life, my work, my connection to the forest. He shared stories through elaborate pantomime about his own people, their traditions, their deep spiritual relationship with the wilderness that sustained them. By the time we finished that first shared meal, I understood that I wasn't caring for an animal or even an unknown species. I was hosting someone whose culture, wisdom, and capacity for joy had been developing for centuries in wilderness areas that humans thought were empty. But I also understood that Gabriel's trust in my goodness would be his destruction. 3 weeks later, when my supervisor made an unscheduled inspection of my station and discovered my guest, the innocent being who'd blessed our simple meal and insisted I eat first, was drugged, caged, and transported to research facilities where scientists would spend the next 39 years studying someone who'd shown me what grace looked like. The emphysema that's killing me is just punishment for a coward who watched them load the most trusting soul he'd ever known into a containment vehicle, while Gabriel looked at me with eyes that couldn't understand why the person who'd shared sacred meals with him was allowing strangers to hurt him. I've spent 4 decades knowing that somewhere in a government laboratory, a being who turned every meal into a prayer of thanksgiving has been systematically tortured by people who will never comprehend that they're destroying something holier than anything they'll encounter in their lifetimes. October 15th, 1984, started as one of those Pacific Northwest mornings where the mist hangs so thick through the old-growth forest that you can barely see 20 feet in any direction. I was conducting my weekly patrol along the Hoh River Trail, checking campsites and monitoring trail conditions after 3 days of steady rain that had turned the forest floor into a sponge of moss and fallen leaves. I'd been working the Olympic Peninsula for 3 years, long enough to develop an intimate knowledge of the ecosystem's rhythms and the subtle signs that indicated when something was out of balance. The forest felt different that morning, too quiet, with an absence of normal wildlife sounds that suggested either the presence of a large predator or some other disturbance that had driven smaller animals into hiding. The discovery came at mile marker 7, where the trail curves close to the river and provides access to a gravel bar that's popular with steelhead fishermen during salmon runs. I was checking for illegal camping when I saw what looked like a massive pile of brown fur, partially concealed by fallen timber about 50 yards from the main trail. My first assumption was that I'd found a dead bear, probably one that had been struck by illness or injury and had crawled to the river to die. But as I approached, several details became clear that challenged that initial assessment. The size was wrong, far larger than any bear species native to the Olympic Peninsula. The posture was wrong too, curled in a position that suggested human-like flexibility rather than typical ursine death positions. When I was close enough to see clearly, my rational mind simply refused to process what I was observing. The creature lying barely conscious beside the Hoh River was unmistakably humanoid, bipedal, with proportions that suggested intelligence and manual dexterity far beyond any known primate species. His fur was dark brown with silver highlights, matted and dirty from weeks of exposure but clearly covering a frame designed for upright locomotion. He was dying. Even without medical training, I could see that this being was in the final stages of starvation and dehydration. His breathing was shallow and irregular, his limbs showed the muscle wasting that comes from prolonged malnutrition, and his skin had the grayish pallor that indicates systemic organ failure. Without immediate intervention, he'd be dead within hours. But what stopped me from immediately radio calling for backup was his face. Despite features that were clearly non-human, a pronounced brow ridge, broader nose, jaw structure adapted for a different diet, his expression was unmistakably one of awareness and intelligence. When my approach roused him to partial consciousness, his eyes tracked my movement with the focused attention of someone evaluating a potential threat or source of help. Those eyes held depths that I'd never seen in any animal: wisdom, pain, and something that could only be described as hope. When he realized I was observing him, he made no aggressive moves, showed no fear, simply waited to see whether my presence would bring assistance or additional suffering. The trust implicit in his stillness was both heartbreaking and terrifying. I knelt beside him and spoke in the same calm voice I'd learned to use with injured wildlife. "Easy, big fellow. You're hurt pretty bad, but I'm going to help you if you'll let me." His response was immediate, a soft sound that rose and fell like a question, clearly an attempt at communication despite his weakened condition. When I offered water from my canteen, he accepted it with careful movements that suggested familiarity with human containers and an understanding of their purpose. When I shared part of my trail lunch, he ate with obvious gratitude but also with manners, waiting for my permission, eating slowly despite his desperate hunger, making sounds that were unmistakably expressions of thanks. The decision to move him to my ranger station was both practical and emotional. Practical because he needed shelter, medical attention, and nutritional support that could only be provided in a controlled environment. Emotional because everything about his behavior suggested someone who deserved protection, rather than the capture and study that would inevitably follow official discovery. Getting him to safety required 3 hours of careful assistance. He was conscious enough to help with the movement, but too weak to travel more than a few hundred yards without rest. During our slow journey through dense forest, I learned that his intelligence extended far beyond basic communication. He understood my explanations of where we were going, recognized when terrain would be difficult for someone in his condition, and consistently demonstrated concern for my welfare, even while struggling with his own survival. By the time we reached my station, a small cabin equipped with basic medical supplies and communication equipment, I'd made a choice that would define the next 6 weeks of my life. Instead of reporting the discovery of what was clearly an undocumented species, I decided to provide care until he was strong enough to return to whatever family or community might be searching for him. The back room of my station became his recovery ward. I set up sleeping space with blankets and cushions, arranged containers for food and water, and positioned my supplies so he could access what he needed without struggling with containers designed for human hands. Most importantly, I disabled my radio and created plausible explanations for why I'd be conducting extended solo patrols with minimal contact with headquarters. That first night, as Gabriel, though he wouldn't become Gabriel until our first shared meal, slept deeply for the first time in weeks, I sat in my main room trying to comprehend what I'd committed myself to caring for. Someone whose very existence challenged everything science claimed to know about evolution, intelligence, and what kinds of consciousness might exist in wilderness areas we thought we'd thoroughly catalogued. I had no idea that my simple act of compassion would lead to the most profound friendship of my life, or that it would ultimately cost my newfound friend everything that made his existence worth living. Gabriel's recovery during those first 2 weeks was remarkable in ways that revealed both his species' resilience and the depth of care his people provided for their own. As his strength returned through regular nutrition and medical attention, he demonstrated intelligence and social sophistication that challenged every assumption I held about non-human consciousness and cultural development. The name Gabriel came during our 3rd day together, when I realized I needed something more personal than big fellow or my guest, to address someone who was clearly a person rather than a specimen. I'd been reading aloud from a book of nature poetry, partly to provide human voice for someone who'd been alone too long, partly to gauge his response to complex language, when I reached a passage about divine messengers appearing in wilderness settings. Gabriel's reaction was immediate and profound. He pointed to himself, then to the book, making sounds that clearly indicated recognition and approval. Whether he understood the religious implications or simply appreciated the musical quality of the name, Gabriel became his identifier in our shared vocabulary, and he responded to it with obvious pleasure. Our communication evolved rapidly beyond basic gestures and expressions. Gabriel had been observing human behavior for years, possibly decades, absorbing language patterns and technological concepts through careful study of park visitors and scientific expeditions. Within a week, he'd mastered essential English words and was combining them with his natural sign language to create surprisingly sophisticated conversations. But more impressive than his linguistic abilities was his curiosity about human culture and his eagerness to share knowledge about his own people's way of life. Gabriel would spend hours examining items from my ranger supplies, field guides, camping equipment, communication devices, asking detailed questions about their construction and purpose. His questions revealed an understanding of metallurgy, engineering principles, and manufacturing processes that suggested his people had been studying human technology with scientific rigor. In return, he taught me about forest management techniques that his species had developed over centuries of careful stewardship. Gabriel showed me plant medicines that could treat injuries and illnesses more effectively than anything in my first aid kit. He demonstrated water purification methods using natural materials that produced cleaner results than chemical treatments. Most remarkably, he explained weather prediction systems based on subtle environmental cues that allowed his people to anticipate storms days in advance. The depth of Gabriel's cultural knowledge became clear during our daily shared meals, which had evolved from basic nutrition into elaborate ceremonies of gratitude and fellowship. Before eating, Gabriel would perform what could only be described as blessing rituals, complex vocalizations combined with gestures that seemed to honor the plants and animals that had provided our sustenance, the forest that had nurtured them, and the friendship that allowed us to share food safely. Gabriel's table manners were exquisite in ways that put formal dining etiquette to shame. He insisted that I always eat first, that portions be shared equally despite his much larger caloric needs, and that conversation during meals focus on positive subjects that enhanced digestion and social bonding. He taught me his people's custom of saving the final bite for the forest spirits, leaving small portions outside as offerings to the consciousness that sustained all woodland life. Through patient storytelling that combined words, drawings, and elaborate pantomime, Gabriel shared details about his family and community that painted a picture of sophisticated social organization. His people lived in extended family groups of 12 to 15 individuals, with territories that spanned hundreds of square miles, but were managed cooperatively to ensure sustainable resource use. They had complex educational systems for young ones, spiritual practices that involved direct communication with forest ecosystems, and cultural traditions that had been preserved through oral history for countless generations. But the most profound aspect of our growing friendship was Gabriel's capacity for emotional depth and psychological insight. He recognized that I was carrying grief from my father's recent death, and he offered comfort through presence and understanding that was more healing than anything professional counselors had provided. Gabriel would sit with me during difficult moments, offering touch and soft vocalizations that conveyed empathy without trying to minimize or rush through necessary sadness. He also shared his own pain in ways that revealed the trauma he'd endured before I found him. Gabriel had been separated from his family during what he described as a violent storm of metal birds, clearly helicopters involved in capture operations that had scattered his community and left him alone in unfamiliar territory. He'd been wandering for months, searching for any trace of his relatives while slowly starving because his education hadn't included survival skills for solitary existence. The bond we developed transcended the boundaries between our species and became the most meaningful relationship of my life. Gabriel was simultaneously my student and my teacher, my patient and my healer, my responsibility and my greatest source of joy. Caring for him gave my work as a park ranger deeper meaning, and his presence made my isolated station feel like a home, rather than just a duty assignment. But as November approached, I began noticing signs that our hidden sanctuary might not remain secret much longer. Helicopter flights over our area had increased, and I'd found evidence of systematic searching by teams with professional tracking equipment. Gabriel's anxiety during aircraft overflights suggested he recognized the same patterns that had led to his family's capture. Our daily conversations began including discussions about contingency plans, routes he could use to escape if our location was discovered, supplies he'd need for extended wilderness survival, and ways I might provide assistance without compromising my position as a park ranger. Gabriel understood that our friendship existed in borrowed time, that forces beyond our control would eventually force choices neither of us wanted to make. The paradise we'd created together was living on borrowed time, and both of us knew that soon we'd face decisions that would test the depth of our loyalty and the strength of our bond. Living with Gabriel meant living with the constant knowledge that our friendship was built on deception that could destroy both our lives if discovered by the wrong people. Every day required careful management of my official duties to maintain the illusion that I was conducting normal ranger activities while actually serving as caretaker and protector for someone whose very existence challenged everything the scientific establishment claimed to know about evolution and intelligence. The radio communications were the most challenging aspect of maintaining our secret. My supervisor expected regular check-ins, incident reports, and coordination with other Park Service personnel. I'd developed elaborate excuses for why I was conducting extended solo patrols with minimal contact, equipment malfunctions, research projects that required sustained observation, and family emergencies that necessitated modified duty schedules. Each lie built upon previous deceptions, creating a house of cards that would collapse the moment anyone decided to investigate my activities closely. Gabriel understood the danger our friendship posed to both of us, and he took extraordinary precautions to avoid detection during the rare occasions when other people approached my station. He'd developed an uncanny ability to sense human presence from enormous distances, probably through hearing and scent capabilities far beyond human parameters. When visitors appeared, Gabriel would retreat to hiding places we'd prepared in the surrounding forest, remaining motionless until potential threats had departed. But the psychological toll of constant concealment was affecting us both. Gabriel, who was naturally social and curious about human culture, began showing signs of depression brought on by forced isolation from the broader world he wanted to understand. He'd spend hours staring out windows toward hiking trails, obviously longing for contact with the park visitors whose conversations and activities fascinated him. My own mental state was deteriorating under the weight of responsibilities I'd never anticipated. Caring for Gabriel required resources I couldn't acquire through official channels: specialized foods for his dietary needs, medical supplies for treating injuries my first aid training couldn't address, and equipment for maintaining his physical comfort in environments designed for human occupation. Every purchase, every supply request, every deviation from normal patterns created potential evidence that could expose our secret. Worse than the logistical challenges was the growing certainty that Gabriel's presence in the Olympic Peninsula had attracted attention from people whose interest was far from benevolent. I'd started noticing aircraft that weren't part of normal Park Service operations, helicopters flying lower and slower than standard patrols, often equipped with what appeared to be scanning equipment designed for detecting heat signatures or unusual wildlife activity. Ground teams had also increased their presence in areas surrounding my station, ostensibly conducting wildlife surveys or research projects. These teams demonstrated tracking skills and coordination that suggested military training rather than academic research. They asked questions about unusual animal signs, requested access to remote areas that were normally off-limits to civilian researchers, and showed particular interest in reports of large predator activity. Gabriel's anxiety during these increased surveillance activities revealed that he recognized the same patterns that had led to his family's capture. His descriptions of the metal bird storm that had scattered his community included details about tranquilizer weapons, containment equipment, and systematic searching techniques that matched what I was observing around the Olympic Peninsula. "They hunt us like we hunt nothing," Gabriel told me during one of our evening conversations, his English having improved to the point where he could express complex thoughts with heartbreaking clarity. "My people take only what forest gives freely. These hunters take everything, leave nothing alive that might tell others what happened." The crisis intensified in mid-November when I discovered that my communications were being monitored by agencies that weren't part of the normal Park Service hierarchy. Equipment I didn't recognize had been installed at communication relay points, and my radio transmissions were being recorded and analyzed by people whose authority and objectives remained unclear. Someone had developed suspicions about my activities and was conducting the kind of systematic investigation that would inevitably uncover our secret. Most ominously, I found evidence that my station itself had been surveilled during periods when I was supposedly away on patrol duties. Tracking devices had been positioned to monitor comings and goings. Hidden cameras were recording activities around the building, and soil samples had been collected from areas where Gabriel's footprints might have been detected. The psychological pressure of constant surveillance was pushing both of us toward breaking points. Gabriel began having nightmares that would wake him with sounds of distress that broke my heart, clearly reliving the trauma of watching his family captured by hunters who saw them as valuable specimens rather than people deserving of protection. He'd wake calling names in his own language, reaching for relatives who were probably dead or imprisoned in facilities designed for studying cryptid biological entities. My own sleep was interrupted by stress dreams about the choices I'd face when our sanctuary was inevitably discovered. Would I have the courage to protect Gabriel when armed agents came to collect him? Could I find ways to help him escape before capture operations reached our location? Was I prepared to sacrifice my career, my freedom, and possibly my life to honor the friendship that had become the most important relationship I'd ever experienced? The final crisis came on November 28, 1984, when my supervisor made an unscheduled inspection visit that I couldn't deflect or postpone. Regional headquarters had received reports about unusual activities at my station, and they were sending a team to conduct comprehensive evaluation of my performance and investigation of any irregularities they might discover. Gabriel and I had perhaps 6 hours to say goodbye and implement whatever escape plan we could devise. But both of us knew that after 6 weeks of intensive surveillance, the people hunting him had probably anticipated every route he might use to disappear back into the wilderness. Our friendship had been discovered, and now we'd learn whether love could triumph over institutional power when the stakes included both our lives. November 28, 1984, dawned gray and bitter cold, with the kind of northwest wind that cuts through layers of clothing and settles into your bones like a permanent ache. I'd been awake since 3 a.m., listening to weather reports and trying to convince myself that the approaching storm might delay my supervisor's inspection visit. But at 07:30 hours, I heard vehicles approaching along the access road, and I knew that our 6 weeks of borrowed paradise were about to end in ways that would haunt me for the remaining decades of my life. Gabriel was waiting in the main room when I emerged from my bedroom, sitting calmly in the chair where he'd spent countless evenings learning about human culture, while teaching me about the spiritual relationship his people maintained with the forest. He'd dressed in the spare park service uniform I'd modified for his larger frame, and he'd groomed his fur to the neat appearance he'd maintained throughout his recovery. "They come for me now," he said with the acceptance of someone who'd always known this day would arrive. "You have been kind, friend William. Better than my people ever hoped to find among humans. Do not let them make you forget that kindness exists in both our species." I tried to convince him to escape while there was still time, to disappear into the deep wilderness where he might elude capture for years. But Gabriel refused with the dignity that had characterized everything about his behavior since our first shared meal. "Running brings only more hunting," he explained, placing one massive hand on my shoulder in a gesture of comfort. "Better that I surrender now before others suffer because they protected me. Maybe in captivity I can teach them that we are people, not animals to be studied." The inspection team consisted of my supervisor, District Ranger Morrison, accompanied by 3 individuals who claimed to be wildlife biologists, but carried themselves with military bearing that suggested specialized law enforcement training. They entered my station with warrants that authorized comprehensive search and seizure of any materials related to unauthorized wildlife management activities. Gabriel greeted them with the same courtesy he'd shown me during our first encounter. Standing to his full height, he offered a formal bow and spoke in clear English that immediately shattered any possibility of treating him as a simple animal discovery. "I am Gabriel of the Olympic Forest people," he said with dignity that transformed the entire dynamic of what should have been a capture operation. "I have been guest of Ranger Harper during my recovery from injuries. I understand that human law requires my detention, and I will cooperate fully to prevent harm to the friend who saved my life." The effect on the inspection team was immediate and profound. Whatever they'd been briefed to expect, it wasn't an articulate being who demonstrated intelligence, cultural sophistication, and voluntary surrender. District Ranger Morrison actually stepped backward, his expression shifting from official authority to something approaching awe. But the 3 wildlife biologists reacted with the clinical efficiency of people who'd been trained for exactly this scenario. Within minutes, they'd produced containment equipment designed for dangerous animals, tranquilizer weapons calculated for Gabriel's estimated body weight, and communication devices that summoned additional support for transporting what they described as a Class A cryptid specimen. Gabriel's transformation during the tranquilization process was the most heartbreaking thing I've ever witnessed. As the drugs began taking effect, the dignified being who'd blessed our shared meals and taught me about forest stewardship became reduced to struggling against restraints designed for wild animals. His eyes sought mine across the chaos of his capture, and I saw in them not anger or fear, but disappointment that human civilization couldn't recognize personhood when it stood directly in front of them. "Remember our meals together," were his last words before unconsciousness claimed him. "Remember that we blessed our food and shared our stories. Remember that friendship existed between our people." That's when Special Agent Morrison approached me with documents that would define the remainder of my life. I could face federal charges for harboring an endangered species without permits, interference with scientific research, and violation of national security protocols related to cryptid management. Or I could accept transfer to administrative duties, sign non-disclosure agreements that carried criminal penalties for violation, and spend the rest of my career knowing that my silence was the price of my freedom. I chose cowardice. Standing in my ranger station while they loaded Gabriel's unconscious body into a containment vehicle designed for transporting dangerous wildlife, I signed every document they placed before me. I accepted reassignment to desk duties that kept me away from field work where I might encounter others of Gabriel's people. I agreed to never speak about the 6 weeks that had become the most meaningful period of my life. Gabriel disappeared into a system designed to unlock whatever biological secrets his species might reveal about human evolution, genetic engineering, or military applications that bureaucrats in Washington had been fantasizing about since the first credible Bigfoot reports crossed their desks, somewhere in underground facilities that don't officially exist. The gentle soul who'd taught me that intelligence and consciousness weren't limited to human biology has spent 39 years as a research subject for people who will never comprehend that they're torturing someone holier than anything they'll encounter in their lifetimes. The emphysema that's killing me started growing in my lungs the day they took Gabriel away, feeding on guilt and shame until it was strong enough to begin its final work. For nearly 4 decades, I've lived with the knowledge that somewhere in a government laboratory, a being who blessed our simple meals and insisted I eat first before his guest has been systematically studied by people who see him as a specimen rather than a person. Gabriel trusted me to protect him when protection required more courage than I possessed. He believed that human friendship could overcome institutional cruelty, that the bond we developed transcended the boundaries between our species. When the test came, when I had the opportunity to prove that his faith in human goodness was justified, I failed completely. That's my confession. That's what's killing me faster than any lung disease ever could.